de Lengua y Cultura, organizado por el Centro de Autoacceso y Mediateca de la Escuela Nacional de Estudios Superiores de la UNAM, Unidad Morelia. Para mí es un gusto poder estar hoy con ustedes porque tenemos un invitado que ha sido recurrente con todas sus presentaciones y con todo el saber que nos ha compartido y es el doctor Jaime Chaboya como parte de no solamente la experiencia de poder escucharle en estas conferencias, charlas, recuerden también que tiene él otras actividades en sus actividades mensuales en donde pueden conocer un poco más de la obra de los escritores que nos presenta. El día de hoy ha preparado una interesantísima presentación acerca de John Ross, From Mexico to Palestine and Back, y vamos a conocer un poco más sobre este importante escritor, sobre esta era en la que se instaura y también de las cosas que podemos aprender sobre la cultura y la lengua. Entonces, para mí es un cordial, le doy la más cordial bienvenida al doctor Jaime y pues el micrófono es suyo. Adelante.
Muchas gracias, maestro Altamirano, y aprovecho también para dar un agradecimiento sincero a la Mediateca y en especial a su coordinadora, la maestra Karina Godina, así que como a todas las autoridades de la Escuela Nacional de Estudios Superiores de la Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México, que hace todo esto posible. Y esta presentación se va a dar en inglés, so I am going to start right now. And don't worry, we will speak in a reasonably slow fashion so that you can understand the content. I hope that you are excited about the topic for today. We are going to talk about poetry, and we are going to use the poetry of this good man. His name is John Ross, and the title of this conference is John Ross, From Mexico to Palestine and Back. So, what is this all about? We know it's a little bit about politics. We know it's about this man, John Ross. We will talk about him in a little bit. And now I already gave you a clue that we will see poetry. So, don't be afraid. Stay informed. Read poetry. You can learn a lot from poetry. Poetry actually can give you more in-depth content than many formal academic school books, text, academic work, newspapers. Some examples of what you are missing when you do not read poetry are all of these other things. Poetry can give you simultaneous realities at the same time, different perspectives with very few words. They can give you flashbacks, or even you can see into the future. And you can go straight into the human heart. And all of these experiences give you more vocabulary. Just as an example, a concrete example, I was working with my students the other day, and we thought about the word want. To want, the verb. That is pretty objective, very down to the central meaning of the word, of the action. You want something. And this is probably the word that you will find in many academic and formal texts. But what about more dimensions? What if there is something different about that verb in the human experience? Do you know these words? To long, to yearn, to crave, to desire. All of these words mean to want. You want something. But every variation has something different about it inside the human experience. And these are the words you will not find typically in academic or formal books because they are more spiritual, they're more emotional. That is why you will find them in poetry and in literature. And instead of knowing just one word when you desire something, when you have an objective, now you have 5. Your vocabulary is much larger now. But you're probably thinking to yourself, poetry is not real. It's not real content. How am I going to be informed about the world if I read poetry? Well, you are correct. There are several authors that write fictional, spiritual poetry that is very separate from the concrete reality. But that is why we are going to talk about John Ross. His poetry is very close to everyday life, especially here in Mexico, and we will see also in Palestine and around the world. This is something that he wrote. He says, corridos, the blues, poems, rags, such as songs, tags, and blogs on the internet, all this popular communicating is a radical way of reporting news. Now, for him, it's probably radical, but it's also very historical. Remember, in the Middle Ages, we had troubadours that would go town to town to tell the news of the king or something, a new law or a new tax, some story that happened in another kingdom. There were no newspapers. There was no radio. You got your news through word of mouth. And to make that entertaining, you turned that news into a song, into a poem. It was easier to memorize. So there is poetry that can keep you informed about the world. Now, a little bit about John Ross. He was a rebel. Yes, not a bad guy. He was a rebel. He was called by some people a troublemaker. I think he was more of a trouble seeker. He would go around the world looking for places that had intense social conflict. He did this because he was a writer. He was a reporter. You can find some of his articles in La Jornada here in Mexico, or in the United States in the San Francisco Chronicles and different other newspapers. Also, his reports would get to Democracy Now!, the report on war and peace with Amy Goodman. And his philosophy was go where the story is. If it's happening somewhere, go there and get inspired. Fill yourself with that experience and write. This is what he says. When you have been there, the story will become part of you. You will taste it. You will feel it. And you will smell it. So, who was he? Well, he was born in New York in the 30s, and he died in a small town here in Michoacan that's called Santiago Itzio. It's close. It's part of the sector of Iguazio, close to the municipality of Sinsunsan. He died there in 2011. Now, during his life, he had lots of very intense experiences, starting with dodging the Vietnam draft. Now, dodging, D-O-D-G-E, to dodge is the same as to avoid. If you dodge a ball, you were moving so the ball goes straight by you and you avoid impact. That is to dodge. A draft D-R-A-F-T, draft, is obligatory military service. In the United States, we have had very few moments where military service was required of all men. The last time was during the Vietnam War. And Mr. Ross dodged his military service. That was illegal. So some years later, he did go to prison to serve time to pay that offense. But meanwhile, he came to Mexico and he lived first in a little town near Cheran, which is in the Purepecha Mountains here in Michoacan. That was in the 50s, when lots of other beat writers and poets were also coming to Mexico. Jack Kerouac was probably in Cancun or San Miguel de Allende. Allen Ginsberg was probably somewhere around Ixtapa or maybe in Yucatan. William Burroughs was probably going in Mexico City. There were lots of beats traveling into Mexico and returning to the United States very frequently in the 1950s and 60s. So Ross was here. He returned to the United States, and then he returned a second time, and this time for good. He actually lived here permanently in Mexico City from 1985 till he died. Yes, he did several trips during this time, but he always had his base in Mexico City. And he reported the earthquake of 1985 here in Mexico. He reported on the Zapatista uprising and other events related to social conflict in Mexico. He reported the event of Intergalactica in 1996, which was organized by the Zapatistas. He reported from the Battle of Seattle, which was a protest against the World Trade Organization in 1999. He also was a human shield in the Iraq War in the late 90s. And in the 2000s, he returned to Iraq and Turkey to the war tribunals. He wrote several books on history of Mexican history and culture, and several books of poetry. So those are the ones we are going to look at right now. Just a few, just a couple, actually. This is an extract of a poem with no title. It was written in Chiapas at the same time when the government and the Zapatistas were reaching a peace resolution. It is written nowhere. No pasa nada aquí, señor. They will dig up the bones and powder them down to powder and lose the powder in the four winds. The Indians will never give up. The past is like a boomerang. It is always returned. It is always present. When you look at the poetry from John Ross, you have a good possibility of finding very accessible vocabulary. Now, I know that maybe some people will need to clarify some of these words. So, powder. What is the word powder? Well, powder is a very fine, solid substance. It's similar to sand. It's granulated material into fine particles. That is powder. Some examples of powder are cooking powder. You use it to make a cake. Let me think, what else? You can use powder on your face. Some makeup, cosmetics are made of powder. So that's a good word to know, powder. Another word, maybe that some people will want to understand better, is boomerang. And a boomerang is a toy. It's more or less, oops, sorry. Let me try that again. It's a toy or a tool more or less shaped like this. You throw it in the air and it does a U movement and it returns to its origin. So now that we have that clarified, remember the context of this poem is Chiapas, when the Zapatistas and the government are making peace with each other. So, what extra information about that event can you detect with this poem? What does it mean when something is not written anywhere? It is written where? Nowhere. You cannot find it, but it is written. What does that mean? What do you understand by that? And then there's another interesting phrase: the Indians will never give up. Something that is interesting about the poetry and writings of John Ross is that he is a foreigner. He is from the United States. And so he will have an interesting perspective on things that happen in Mexico. Probably different than what another Mexican would have. This is how you make a complete image for your own self, and you can complete information. You have information that comes from the government, information that comes from the Zapatistas, information that comes from Mexican nationals, and then you can have information that comes from international observers. Altogether, they can make a complete or a more complete picture. You will understand more about what was happening in Chiapas in 1997. Let's go to another poem. This one is 2 slides long. This is the first slide. The poem is called I Speak to You of This Land. And remember, do not be afraid of poems. This has a very basic vocabulary. It has very interesting content, and I hope that you enjoy it. I speak to you of this land, this one land, and how we live upon this land. I speak to you of these trees, the olive tree, this one tree, and how, when they strip its bark, burn its limbs, chainsaw its twisted trunk, tear out its roots from the sobbing ground, they erase the name of the people of this land, this one land. Okay, so before we go to the second part, let's just stay here and look at this and try to understand it. So John Ross is speaking to us of a certain geography. What geography? He doesn't say, but we know there are olive trees. You will know an olive tree because that is where we get olive oil, a cooking ingredient. Olive oil comes from the olive tree. Olive trees are also famous because they can live thousands of years. What about the word strip? That is to remove something. You might hear it in other contexts, but let's say they stripped me of my money. Someone was robbed. The money was removed from their person. That is to strip. But we're not talking about a person here. We're talking about a tree. So what is getting stripped? The poem says it's bark, it's getting stripped. If you do not know this word, do not worry. You already know that bark has some relation to a tree. So think, what part of a tree can you strip? If you were thinking about the cortex that is outside of and protects the trunk, the wood of the tree, you are correct. And you did not need a dictionary for that. You figured that out on your own. Nice job. Here's another one. Chainsaw. It's a compound word. Chain, we know what a chain is, and saw, it is a tool to cut. A chainsaw is a cutting tool that uses a chain. These are frequently mechanical, they use gasoline or something like that. They make a lot of noise. Now, twisted. Twisted is when something is deformed, when it's circulating, when it circulates on its own axis. That's twist. Let me see here. So if I have a piece of paper and I can twist it this way. Now, here is another word that is very good to know because you will not see this in academic or formal writing. Sobbing. Sobbing. Some of you know that to sob is the same as to cry. But what is the difference? To cry is very generic. It's very universal. It covers all kinds of expressions that are loud and with pain or something. But to sob has this extra dimension of sadness to it, of something that is very hopeless, of something that is very desperate and lost. It adds a complete new dimension to the information here. Do we understand what's happening so far? When John Ross says, I speak to you of this land, what do you know is happening here? We know there are trees. We know that the trees are under attack. They are getting burned. They are getting cut down. They are getting extricated from the earth. You know all of that with just a few words. You don't need a complete story. You can build the story in your head. Let's go to the second part. I speak to you of the corn, this maize, its seeds, and how, when they corrupt it with their chemistry, alter its plasma, make it something else, a commodity to be bought and sold. They erase the name of the people for whom the corn grows. I speak to you of this land, this one land, and how, when they erase the name of the people who lived upon this land, there will be no more land. This sounds more familiar, more close to us. We don't have a lot of olive trees here in Mexico, but we do have lots of corn. And a very elegant, very proper way, a very respectful way to say corn in English is maize. Maize. Maize is the same as corn. Most of all of the other words are pretty easy to understand. So, where was this poem written? Where does it originate from? John Ross published this poem in 2006, but he wrote it 3 years before, between a trip from Palestine and Chiapas. So does that make more sense now? He is relating the experience of something that is happening half a world away with something that is happening in Mexico. In one place, he is talking about the olive trees. And in another place, he's talking about the corn. But his conclusion is the same. He's talking about this land that for some reason, this land is connected to the name of the people who live there. And when this land gets destroyed, not only do they erase the name of the people, to eliminate it, to remove it from visibility, but the consequence is much greater. The land itself is destroyed. Now, remember, this is 2003. We do have some events happening right now in the Middle East. So you can think about that, or you can think about what happened 20 years ago in Chiapas and in the Middle East. What do you think about this poem? Here's some questions to help you. Can you relate the poems to anything in real life, in history? And just to make a contrast with academic texts and formal writing, can you identify different experiences, different voices at the same time? Usually a formal manner of writing will focus on one speaker at a time. Poetry, on the other hand, can focus on many voices at the same time. It will also give you clues to emotions, motives, the implications, and possible futures. Did you find any of those things in these two examples of poetry? I'm sure you did. And so that's great because yes, you can read poetry. Do not be afraid of poetry. Poetry will help you to widen the horizons of your thoughts, of your spirit. It will help you to understand the world better. It will increase your vocabulary greatly. And it will make you just a better person, more sophisticated. If you want to read it complete, remember, John Ross has lots of books, about 10 books of history. They're all in English. And he has about another 10 books of poetry, also all in English. Something interesting about John Ross is that his reporting for the newspaper, for the radio, for all those news companies was in Spanish here in Mexico. But when he wrote about history and culture and poetry, he was exclusively writing in English. So, did you like this? Are you interested in having more? My name is Jaime Chavoya, and I facilitate 3 other workshops at the Mediateca. I have a poetry club. I have a workshop on popular America that includes history, politics, economy, pop culture, all different kinds of conspiracy theories and other interesting and fascinating aspects of about the United States. And another workshop called Creating Stories. Popular America and Creating Stories are friendly workshops for people with visual disabilities. And this is not the only uh, ones like this. At the Mediateca, we have 14 languages you can check out and that you can learn with us, with online or in-person learning assistance, with conferences, cooking classes, workshops, conversation clubs. And of course, we have lots of services that are special for disability, for people with disability. Now, if you want to know more about this, check out the other videos on this YouTube channel. You can also check us out on the social networks, or you can email us, mediateca@inesmorelia.unam.mx. And also, if you're feeling just a little bit more in a rush, you can send us a WhatsApp person. And if you also want to be more adventurous, come in person and visit us here in Morelia, Michoacan. And that is all about for this presentation. I am very happy to have shared this time with you, this information. Remember, poetry can help you get a long way in your English, and I hope that you take advantage of that. And once again, I thank el maestro Eduardo Altamirano por esta oportunidad, y también a la maestra Karina Godina, la coordinadora de la Mediateca de la ENES Unidad, de la ENES UNAM Unidad Morelia. Y bueno, muchas gracias.
Pues muchas gracias, doctor, por todo esto que nos ha compartido. Perdón. Por todo esto que nos ha compartido. Seguramente, junto con las otras charlas sobre estas reflexiones que nos ha hecho el doctor, pueden buscar en las listas de reproducciones de este canal las otras conferencias y bueno, vamos a poder sumar más y más saberes a nuestra formación y el diálogo que tengamos, no solo como él decía en este tipo de textos, sino también en darle la oportunidad a la poesía como una manera de poder aprender. Entonces, la poesía en sí misma significa, es un mensaje muy potente, pero también situado en una época histórica como la que él nos ha contado, bueno, pues tiene grandes y grandes significados para las personas, nuestra comunidad y obviamente la humanidad entera. Entonces, siempre es un tema mm, que podemos seguir inspirándonos. Entonces, por ahora y a nombre de la maestra Karina Godina, les agradecemos que nos hayan acompañado a este punto. En la caja de información van a poder encontrar la descripción de este video, así como los medios de contacto. Recuerden, tenemos muchos idiomas y ustedes pueden tener la oportunidad de aprender junto con nosotros y nosotros poderles asesorear y guiar en este camino para poder hablar una segunda o tercera lengua. Muchísimas gracias por todo. Nos vemos en la próxima emisión hablando sobre la bandera alemana. Cuídense, nos vemos el lunes.